Thank you all so much for joining. This is our third webinar in a series of 3 webinars we've been hosting in 2021 for the green industry on managing resilience to COVID-19 and beyond. The impetus for this webinar was some funding that we received through the CARES Act. Luckily, the green industry has fared fairly well throughout COVID-19 due to everyone staying at home and working on their landscaping and their yard. But it's brought its own unique challenges as this increased demand has occurred, as well as new safety precautions that all businesses are having to follow. And so this webinar series has been looking at different topics to help the green industry, from marketing strategies to financial resilience. And now we're gonna, in this webinar, be talking about sustainability and how to do more sustainable landscaping and sustainable forestry. And so thank you all so much for joining us. And we're gonna kick it off today with Alex Ballard from the Georgia Forestry Commission. Alex, I see you have your screen shared, so I will just hand it off to you.
Thank you. So as she mentioned, well, first off, good morning, everyone. As Jill mentioned, I'm Alex Ballard. I'm with the Georgia Forestry Commission. I'm a community forester and I work in the southeast region of the state. So today I would like to talk to you about the proper tree planting techniques. I know that this may sound like a simple process, and for the most part it is, but we just want to talk about a couple of things that, some of the techniques you can do to make a better tree in the landscape and sustain this tree canopy for years to come. So, how do I make it go?
I think just pushing arrows on your computer.
There we go. I tried that. All right. So why do we plant? A lot of people plant trees starting, they may like a tree they want to put in their yard for aesthetics or beautification, or they just like trees. It feels good to them to plant a tree. However, there's so many other reasons why to plant a tree and why to want these benefits. Moving on. So some of the reasons is, replace lost canopy. We are always fighting to replace lost canopy. Either it's due to urbanization, which is a huge part of it, timber harvest, other turnover, crops turning into different things. There's always a loss of canopy. So that's the main thing. We want to put canopy back. There's so many ecosystem services, for the birds, for the wildlife, for just air, storage, stormwater retention, just so many things that trees can do. We also have all the social and economic benefits from it. So there's 100 reasons why you should plant a tree and why you want to plant a tree. Just know that when you do plant a tree, it's a great thing. So plant with a purpose. There's a reason for it, and it's a reason to be proud to do it. Before you plant a tree, you either have a site or you have a species. One of the two is what you want. So if you have a specific species of tree that you want to plant, you can't necessarily put it in a site that you want. You got to make sure that that tree fits that site. So if you have a specific tree, pick the specific site for that tree. If you have a site that you want it, you need to find a tree that matches that site, because you don't want to put something there like if there's not available soil space, if you have a tree that likes full shade and you put it out in the sun, it's not going to do well. So these are some of the things you want to think about before you plant the tree. Also, future development plans. You don't want to plant something and then baby it and take care of it for the first few years and then, have to go dig it up because somebody wanted to build a deck out back or something. So have all these things in mind when you start planting trees, because we want to plant the trees to make them sustain in the landscape. You don't want to plant something and then have to remove it in a few years. As I said before, available space is the biggest thing you want to consider. Before you plant a tree and pick a spot, look up, look down, make sure there's nothing in the way of it. If there's a sidewalk right next to it, don't do it, because those roots are going to go through the sidewalk. If there's a big overhead power line above it, don't do it, because it's going to cause problems in the future, and the power companies will come and they will prune that tree away from that power line. And sometimes it's not the best pruning practices. So we just want to keep all the big trees out from around the power lines. And then you want to make sure that there's plenty of space for that tree to grow, as well as the roots. So think about that before you plant a tree. I'll mention later, call 811 before you dig, because that also has a factor of where you may or may not be able to plant that tree. So you want to stay away from all the utilities like that, above ground and below ground. So here's an example of the right tree, right place. These are wrong. So wrong tree, wrong place. I just wanted to show that it can happen. It will exist. You can see the tree on the left. It has very minimal soil space and those roots are somewhere under there and it's working, but we don't recommend it. And you can see how this tree's been pruned to be able to go around this power line. And that is a great thing, but it's not recommended. The tree on the right, you can see that they basically, cut the whole top and left side out of this tree. That's not good pruning practices, because when you prune like that, it's going to shoot out a lot of epicormic sprouts, and then you're going to have a really bushy tree, just limbs like the one on the left. So just think about it before you plant. Make sure it's in the right spot. Make sure you're not causing problems for any future people to have to deal with, because we're planting these for the future generations. It's not us. So here's a little diagram we have about the available space. This it helps guide you to figure out where your roots are going to be in the future. We use a formula. You take the tree's diameter and you multiply it by 1.2 or 1.3, and that'll give you your critical root zone. And while I'm on the topic of critical root zone, if you're ever in a situation to where you have to, do some groundwork around a tree, you can use this to figure out where these critical roots are. And that way you can stay away from those, because if you cut out too much of the critical roots, then that tree is going to be toast. So you want to really map out where your tree is going to be, where your roots are going to be, and where your canopy is going to be. This is another graphic here. It's basically the same as the one before. I just like this one a little more because it shows the roots. Roots grow out. They don't necessarily grow down. They do in certain areas if it's, a wet soil or if it's thin, but they grow out for the most part. They grow in the top 2 feet of the soil. They don't go deeper than that. So you always have to think, where are my tree's roots? They're growing out. Same thing here, just to show the roots. I want people to understand that roots grow out and not down. So after you've kind of looked at your spot and you're thinking about, a species, what kind of tree do I want to plant? Definitely look at the sunlight and shade tolerance. Like I said before, you don't want to plant a tree that needs shade in full sun. An example I use is I'm in South Georgia, and the native dogwoods just don't do that well because they're an understory tree. They like partial shade. And when you plant them as a street tree, they can't deal with the South Georgia heat, and they never grow well. They're stunted, they grow slow, and they just don't ever really look that healthy. Another thing is drainage requirements. If there's a tree that wants well-drained soil and you plant it in an area that holds water, that tree will not grow vigorous like it should. It'll always be partial healthy, and it just won't grow correct. If you do bigger jobs, if you're planting like a lot of trees, I would recommend doing a soil test just to see what's there and know, what kind of tree species you're open to with how that soil is. Another thing is, a lot of people they ask about fertilization at planting. I don't recommend it, because if you get a B&B tree, balled and burlap, it's coming from the nursery and it's already been root pruned. So it's already stressed out a little bit. And you don't want to, if you give it that fertilizer, it's going to put out a bunch of little shoots just to make more leaf area. And at this point, it's going to make a bushy tree, and it's going to mess up kind of the structure of how that tree should be. So what you really need, kind of think about fertilizer, just water the tree. It wants water. It does not want fertilizer. In a couple of years, once that tree's established, then you can think about fertilizing the tree and giving it what it needs. This is some more about basically just selecting specimen trees. We recommend the ANSI nursery stock standards. It is just the highest standard of tree you can get. They're going to have, good form. They're not going to have diseases. They're not going to have any sunspots. They're not going to have any problems. So if you can find a nursery that has ANSI stock, or Florida stock's pretty good as well, just do that. And also, when you're in the nursery, you don't want to pick a tree that's been topped. If somebody just, cut the top out of it, you don't want that, because when you cut out that main leader, that's where the growth regulators are. And if you chop that off, then it kind of throws the whole tree off balance from the start. So we'll kind of watch that when you're picking a tree in the nursery. If you also want to watch for any kind of scars or scrapes that are on the trunk of that tree, because you may think that it'll grow out of it, it'll seal itself over, but it's really not going to. Once it gets scraped like that as a young tree, it's going to hold on to that for the rest of its life. So just kind of pick the best tree you can. You don't want to pick something that's halfway broken when you buy it. So just be sure to really inspect that tree in the nursery. If you can, if you're looking at trees and potted plants, if you can check out the roots, that would be great. I know not every nursery is going to let you pull trees out of the pots to look at the roots, but if you can, do that because you want to stay away from the girdling roots or something that may be pot bound. This is kind of reiterating what I was saying, but I want to talk about the graphic on the right side on the top where it says removing a competing leader. This is an example of when you can prune as a young tree. The only reason you should prune a young tree like this is if there's a branch going up through the middle and you need to get it out of the way. If it's causing problems for other branches, you could cut that one like the dotted line shows. And then at the top of the tree, if you have two leaders like this at the top of the tree and they're competing for dominance, it's going to continue to do that throughout the life of that tree. And at some point, they're just going to kind of split away from each other. So when you plant a tree and you have two main leaders at the top, if there's not just one that's the obvious dominant leader, you need to cut one off and let it seal up while it's young like this and let that main leader, grow as it should. So that's the only reason you should prune a tree when it's young like this. So preparing your site, obviously, like I said before, you want to call 811. That's kind of first and foremost. It's also good to do a perk test just to see how your soil is draining. That kind of will also help you determine what kind of tree you're going to have. And you want to check out the compaction level because if you're in an area that's just super compact and it's difficult to dig, then you're going to have to make a bigger planting hole because those roots are going to need to, run out and get what they need. So just these are some of the things you want to think about when you're, looking at your site before you plant. So next, once you decide which tree you're going to get from the nursery and you've picked a good one and there's no scrapes and scars on it and it's a beautiful tree, you got to take it to the planting hole. There's a lot of things you can do here during the handling that can, prevent a lot of issues that are pretty bad for trees in the long run. The first one being, if you get a tree and you're traveling with it, wrap it in some sort of a tarp or sunscreen or something like that so that it doesn't get windburn. The windburn will rip all the leaves off. And like I said before, they're already kind of partially stressed out from the nursery, especially a B&B tree that's been pruned out. So you just want to wrap those trees up. Another thing, if you get like a big tree, like a B&B or a big potted plant, when you're moving it, don't grab it by the trunk or don't grab it by the canopy area. You want to grab it by that pot or you want to grab it by that root ball because you can damage trees this way. So you want to always grab it at the bottom when you're moving them. And if you're having to use like a tractor or something for B&B trees, you would strap it up at the root ball and you want to walk with it with the tractor because I've been in a situation where a tree has scraped the bucket of a tractor while moving it and it put a big long scar on the trunk and that's also really bad about it. And you want to protect that terminal bud, as I said before. All right, so once you start planting, here's a little graphic of a B&B tree. First and foremost, you dig your hole and the biggest thing here is you want to dig it 3 times wider than the original root ball. So if it's a foot wide, you got to dig a 3-foot wide hole. You always want to dig wider than you do deep because like I said before, those roots are growing out, not down. Before you put this B&B tree in the hole, I would recommend measuring how deep that root ball is because once you put it in the hole, it's really hard to move it and lift it up. So we recommend planting like an inch above soil grade. You want to at soil grade or an inch above because when you water them in, they're going to sink just a little bit. So once you've got it measured and you've got your hole the correct depth, then you can roll that tree in there. And at this point, you're going to have the burlap and the wire basket on this tree still. You can begin to cut this off. We recommend cutting the top 2/3 off. The bottom is okay because like I said, the roots are not growing down, they're growing out. So you want to basically take off any barrier that's going to be in the way from those roots growing out. Some nurseries will say that they have a biodegradable burlap sack. I've heard it. I don't leave it on there. They recommend, they say that it's good to leave them if it's biodegradable like that, but I don't want a barrier in the way if there doesn't have to be one. So cut that basket off, cut that burlap off, and then you have your tree in your hole. When you're backfilling, use the native soils because that's what's there and that's kind of what that tree is going to be living in. That's what it needs. You don't want to put a bunch of potting soil in there. You don't want to do any of that. So once you start doing all the backfill, you're going to look at your tree afterwards and you're going to want to remove any type of tags, any, a trunk wrap, because sometimes they wrap the trunk to protect it from the wind as well. So there's just all these things that you can look at while you're planting, and these are the things that matter. And we use this example, you can take $1 million tree and put it in a $5 hole, and it's going to result in a bad tree. You really need to take these steps while planting this tree to ensure that it's going to be sustainable and be here in the landscape. Just to reiterate, the planting hole should be 3 times wider than the root ball. If it's possible, if you want to put more care into your tree, make it 10 times wider, just to, till up that compacted soil. So like I said before, dig no deeper than needed. Another thing on the B&B trees, when you unload them, this is also as well as container trees. At the bottom, at the base, where it meets the soil level, you want to kind of rub some of that soil back, because sometimes they can be planted too deep in the soil, and then they don't have that natural taper that they need at the bottom. So you want to look for that taper where it kind of gets wide at the bottom of the tree. And you can also see like the top 2 or 3 main roots. So that's what you want right at your soil grade or right above. So remove any excess dirt on top of it. Slope the sides of the hole. When, real wide holes, slope them. Sometimes they can be sheared off from the shovel and be like a smooth edge. Just take your shovel and scar up the side, give the root, an area to grow through. Don't just make it smooth. Container trees, same principles as B&B. You make the planting hole pretty wide. The biggest thing with container trees is that the roots grow out and they hit the side, and then they start growing in a circle. This is true in all forms of it. That's probably a 15-gallon pot there. And a lot of people want to say, don't harm the roots and all that. If it looks like this, it's okay, cut the roots. There's a diagram on the side. You can cut up the sides of it. You can cut an X at the bottom. It's better to get these roots untangled now before you put it in the hole. Extremely important. This is another diagram here, just to show you, it's kind of a scale to show you how big the tree would be, how big your planting hole should be, and the planting space. So it's just, don't think about it. I've been the product of, I would set my container tree on the ground and I would take my shovel and dig out around the tree and then just drop the tree down in there like just a cylindrical hole. I didn't mess with the roots. I didn't make a wide planting hole, and it just not result in a good tree. So I can speak from experience where I've done it wrong. And you also, another thing is you don't want to plant too deep. And the reason I keep saying that is if you do plant it below soil grade, it's going to sink, and roots need just as much air as they need water. And if you plant it too deep, those roots never get air, and they actually try to grow up instead of out. So you want to plant it at or above grade. Another type of tree is the bare root, which is going to be like basically your saplings or your seedlings. We give these out all the time. It's great for volunteers and all this. You don't have to put so much into digging the planting hole because they're only a few inches in the ground. But the main thing you want to watch for here is that you don't J-root the tree. And what I mean by that is when you stick it in the ground, you don't want those roots coming down and then curling back up. You want them to stay down so that they'll grow down and out. You don't want them growing back up. So any questions, you can put them in the box and I'll answer them later. This is the biggest part for me, watering your tree. I tell people, if you don't plan to water your tree, don't plant the tree because it's not going to make it. It really needs care, all the care. And so whenever you plant your tree, watering starts that day. You don't wait, it starts that day. You plant your tree, you water your tree all in one go. Determine how you're going to water your tree. Is it going to be a 5-gallon bucket? Is it going to be a water hose? What is your plan for watering? You need to water these trees throughout the growing season. Basically October, November in South Georgia. I don't know that there is a dormant season anymore because it never gets cold. So just continue to water the tree if there is no rain. So if you do get rain, if you get about an inch, that'll suffice not watering for that week. But what I would say is we recommend 5 to 7 gallons per caliper inch. So some of these nursery trees you're getting, 2 to 3 inches. You're going to give that tree, 10 to 15 gallons each week. You can do it with, any way you want to, but 10 or 15 gallons per week, or 5 to 7 gallons per inch. And sometimes in the summer months, you may need to double that, but you want to water one time a week. It's better to water one time heavily then every day a little bit. So your tree wants to get completely, watered and then drain out and then watered and drain out. It doesn't want just to get a little bit each day. Here's some aids that are used in watering young trees like this. On the left is a tree gator. On the right is one called a tree diaper. A lot of people think that if they put these on trees, they don't have to water it. It's going to water itself. That's not the case. These are bags that allow the water to drain slowly. So what this purpose is that there is no runoff. If you take a 5-gallon bucket out there and drop it on this tree, then a lot of water is going to run off and it's not getting the full 5 gallons. These bags have small holes in them and you still have to fill them up. I run across it in towns all the time where these bags are just empty all the time. And another thing with these bags, you want to take them off after the growing season because these bags can hold fire ants. Everything will get in there and cause problems for the base of that tree. So these are good to allow water to drain slowly, but just keep in mind that they can also cause problems if left there. Mulching is another one of my favorites here. It has so many benefits. Trees and grass, they coexist, but they don't like each other. They're competing for the same nutrients, the same water, and you don't want anything competing with your tree. You want to put the tree in an area that makes it feel like it's still in the woods. There's so many stressors on trees already with an urban environment that, we want to make this tree feel at home as possible because we're already stacked up against so many obstacles when we're planting in an urban environment. So you want to recreate that natural growing condition that it has. Mulch retains all kind of moisture. It suppresses weeds. It has microorganisms in it that are good for the tree. And when that stuff breaks down, it's also good for the soil over time. So there's unlimited benefits with mulch. There's no reason you should not mulch around your tree. And personally, my favorite is if there's mulch around a tree, then there's no lawnmower around that tree. There's no guy weed eating around that tree, cutting it up with the weed eater string. So mulch is really good as a barrier just to keep other things out, as well as everything, the benefits of it. You're going to want to mulch early spring or late fall. Use good materials. Don't get something that's got a bunch of harmful stuff in it that's going to injure your tree. We're here to help it, not harm it. So I don't know about some of the mulches out there, but if you get a good mulch, most time it's good for it. You want to break up that old mulch once it gets hard and crusty all around. You want to kind of take a rake and break all that up or remove it. Just take it out and put some new mulch in so you can get all the benefits from the mulch to keep going. Another thing with mulch, once you mulch your tree, go and pull all the mulch away from the trunk because just like the bags, you don't want anything touching your trunk, which is going to lead me into this volcano mulching. This done with the pine straw wouldn't be as harmful as it would be with mulch. And I've done this before. I've, ridden my lawnmower and pointed that chute straight at a pine tree and made a nice bed around the pine tree with pine needles. With pine needles, it's not as bad, but we do not recommend this at all because what this does is all these roots are they'll try to grow out into that soil and they're growing out and then there's nowhere to go once they get past the mulch. So they have to grow back down. So it's basically the roots are growing in places they should not grow and it's harmful for the tree as well. Also, it'll contain like mold and mildew and all that within that mulch. So you want to stay away from this at all costs. Here's another example of volcano mulching as well. This is how it should look. You want about 2 or 3 inches of mulch, not more than that. Less than that's okay, but 2 or 3 inches is a good limit. And then you want to scrape it back away from the trunk of that tree. You want to just see bare dirt around the trunk of the tree. And you want to extend this mulch, out to the drip line and each year just, keep growing the mulch. All right, this is a slide on staking. When I see a lot of people stake trees and leave it, it's a lot like the watering bags and things like that. Staking a tree is there for the purpose of the tree not falling over. Some people put those stakes in and they run their strapping around the tree and that tree is so tight that it cannot move. When this is done, that tree doesn't have its natural sway and it doesn't build the taper that it needs to be a strong tree. So as soon as you take the straps off, it's a weak tree and it could fall over or snap. So when you put your strapping on there, you want to have about 3 inches of slack in each one, because you want that tree to move. You want it to sway with the wind. You want it to grow that wood that keeps it strong and be able to withstand wind when it gets older. And then after a year, you take those straps off. Once those roots are out and they anchor the tree down, you're good. So the straps, remember, you want the tree to move. It's there to keep it from falling over, not from moving. And be sure to remove everything, because if you don't, that tree is just going to eat those straps and it's going to cause more problems in the future. Here's an example. These are some tags that were left on, and the tree just grows around it. And what it's doing is it's girdling that tree, and the tree will grow around it, but it's harming it, and it's cutting off the water supply, stuff like that. Another problem, wound in the trunk, we talked about that. Mowing equipment, we talked about that. Don't scrape it with the side of your lawnmower. Don't hit it with the weed eater. Like, don't do any of these things, because it will live with that scar forever. Root damage, if you can help it, don't cut roots of trees. If you do have to, do some stuff around the roots, use that factor I told you of the 1.3 times the diameter of the tree, and that will tell you the radius of your critical root zone, and you can kind of stay away from those roots. Improper pruning. Pruning is a topic for another day, but I'm going to talk about it a little right now. Don't just go and cut a limb in the middle of the limb. You want to cut it back to a lateral branch. So when you cut that, you want to push those nutrients to another limb. You don't want to chop it off in the middle, because at that point, you're going to allow a bunch of pests and disease to come in at that spot, because the tree will not seal itself. If you cut it back to a lateral branch, there's a lot of stored carbohydrates right there, and it will seal itself over and then send all the nutrients to the other branch. So don't chop it off in the middle, run it back to a lateral branch, and then go from there. And also, I know in the landscape, residential, commercial, people use chemicals. They use fertilizers for grass. Just be wary of it. Understand that the tree probably doesn't like these things. And, nitrogen will green stuff up and all that. If you put a lot of nitrogen on a tree, it's going to just sprout a lot of little sprouts. And then it's just like a bushy tree. So that it's not necessarily what you want. So just understand what your tree wants, understand what your tree doesn't want, and try to stay away from some of those things. Here's a problem with the basket. If you left the burlap and the basket on there, this tree, the roots never grew out. They were just trapped inside there. So like I said, remove the top 2/3 of that basket. If the nursery tells you to leave it on there, just say okay, and then go to your job and take the basket off. Like, put it in the hole, take the basket off, you don't need it. Also, like I was talking about, removing the dirt on top of this, on the top side of this, you want to get it to where you can see that flare of the tree at the bottom. You just don't want a straight pole going down. You want it to flare out. So if there's too much dirt on top, take that off as well. You want to see that flare. You want that to be just above soil grade. Here's a pretty bad example of root bound. This is a bad example. So you definitely want to cut this. If you put this in the ground, it's going to do absolutely nothing but grow in a circle, and it will never anchor down the way it should. So take that saw, cut it up, take your gloves, take your fingers, rough it up. I mean, it's better to I'm not going to say harm the tree now than later. It's not harming it. You're helping the tree. It might seem like you're doing bad things, but you're helping the tree. Don't cut them all, like don't cut it off, but cut some slices in that thing to where you can, and you'll feel it release. Like when you cut through that, it'll kind of release out the root ball, and then you can plant it and kind of move these roots around kind of where you need to put them, and they'll grow out. Another example of girdling roots here, this one was planted a little too deep. You can see how these roots are growing up because they weren't getting enough air, and it never anchored down. They were just they were spinning for one, and then they're also growing up and not out. So I'm showing you some of the problems of this is what happens when this is what I was telling you what to do to avoid these things. So this is also the product of a girdling root. If you have a tree and right under the soil, you see a big root coming around the base of your tree, it's better to cut that than leave it, because at a certain point when your tree grows bigger in diameter, it's going to hit that girdling root, and that root is going to cut off the water supply. And this tree here, you can see it just basically just snapped like this. It killed the tree totally, and it just fell over and snapped. So you don't want those girdling roots. And if you cut them at the beginning, when you pull them out of the pot, you don't have to deal with this down the road. And a young tree can deal with these, these prunings, these cuts, and a young tree can deal with it way better than an older tree can. So always think it's better to do these things when the tree is young. Some people ask, how long do I take care of my tree? I usually tell people the first 2 or 3 growing seasons. So it's a commitment. If you want to plant a tree, you got to water that tree for the next 2 years. And after about 2 or 3 years, you can start do like structural pruning. You can kind of prune off the branches that you're not going to need, or the lower branches, to get that tree canopy the way you want it. But you do this as the tree grows, because you don't want to cut off more than 25% of the canopy at one time. So when you plant the tree, you're devoted for 2 years. You got to water it, you structurally prune it when you need to, just to keep it healthy, because we're trying to create sustainable trees. We don't want these trees dying off in 5 years. We want them to stay here. We want our kids to have these trees. So just take some of these tips and run with them. As I said before, we're planting something that wants to be in the woods. It's not in the woods. Urban environment, the stressors in it, the heat, everything is bad for trees. And we're doing everything we can to keep these trees alive in the landscape. So some of these just simple practices will help you just make a better tree for the future. So, and we're at the end. So is there any questions?
Hey, Alex. Yes, this is Greg. I'm going to field a couple of questions and just pitch them to you. We have one in the chat box and one in the Q&A box. We'll go to the chat box first. We've got one from Timothy Burt, and he wants to know, how about an emerald arborvitae? How far apart should they be, and how wide of a hole?
I'm not sure about this variety specifically. Is it like a Leland cypress?
It's an evergreen, a conifer. So I can talk a little bit about it. So an emerald arborvitae, Tim, would be a tall columnar plant. It's going to reach about a 2 to 3 foot diameter. Used a lot for tight spaces and screens and walls. And I know the nurseries are growing these things like crazy. So, typically the mature width is the spacing on center at minimum. So if you wanted to create a more solid screen, you might squeeze that just a little bit, but you definitely want to give them room to reach that width. So I would go, maybe 2.5 feet if you want those to just touch. But if you go any tighter than that, I've seen them planted almost just root balls touching at the time of planting. And then what happens is they become crowded, and you start to get, hollow areas between the trees, and the trees are under stress and competing for root space. And so sometimes that can cause issues. So I would suggest, 2 to 3 foot spacing on those. And as far as the root ball, Alex mentioned 3 times the size of the root ball. So depending on, whether you're planting a 1 gallon or a 3 gallon, that root, those roots, basically you're trying to relieve the compaction in the area immediately around that root ball. So,
right,
by going 3 times the width. Now, if you're going to do a screen where you're planting those close together, you might even, depending on what kind of equipment you have, you could even, carve a linear trench that's,
right.
3 times the width of the root ball, and then backfill. So does
That's right.
that sound, you agree with that, Alex?
I like it. So yeah, all trees, whatever the tree species is, you want that planting hole to be 3 times wider than the root ball. And that's just because you have new young roots, and you don't want them fighting their first 2 years to get out, because they're going to grow about 18 inches. A healthy tree root will grow about 18 inches a year. So about 1.5 feet. So if you have if your root ball is 1 foot wide, you want it 3 foot wide. So the first 2 years, those roots don't have to fight through hard compacted soil. So you want it, like I said, you're just trying to start these trees as best as possible.
All right, our next question is from Bob, and his question is about a technique called root shaving. This is something the University of Florida experimented with. His question is, what are your thoughts about shaving the root bound plants, root bound container grown plants, shaving that root ball? And the technique that I understand this to be is to take a spade and actually trim the outer layer of roots off of that root ball. Any thoughts on that, Alex?
Yeah, so that can't hurt as well. I've done it with a shovel at planting. Sometimes when you're sawing into it, it's too many roots there and you can't saw through it. So I'll take my shovel blade and I will try to carve the outsides of the roots, because you got to think that pot has a lot of roots within it. And And if they're circling so bad that they're doing that, they probably did that as well in the pot they were before. So sometimes I've gotten into roots and it'll be gurgling real bad on the 15 gallon and I'll cut through that, but it still didn't release. And I'll keep cutting, into it to get a little more inside of it. And basically imagine a 10-gallon pot sitting inside of a 15-gallon pot. So if they had it in a 10-gallon and it circled, and then they put it in a 15-gallon and it grew out and circled. So you have different layers in there. So sometimes if you shave that outside off, it still has roots that are circling, within it. So sometimes the saw shovel technique, whichever will loosen that up. And I know as far as like the field grown trees, before they pull these trees, they go and they use a spade and they cut the roots. They go in there and cut the roots the size of the root ball. And they do this a few weeks ahead of time before you buy them. And what this is doing when they cut those roots, it's kind of influencing a bunch of feeder roots to come out. So they want to promote like smaller, younger roots. So they'll kind of root prune in the nursery to cause this to happen. So it wouldn't be a bad thing to do that.
Yeah, and I'll just just add to what Alex said, and I agree with all that. Keep in mind the species too. Bob, I wouldn't adopt it as a standard practice with every plant.
Right.
Use your judgment on what Alex described. Is it a fibrous root system, something like a southern magnolia may have a really dense fibrous root system, and shaving that outer may not cause as much damage as it would to say an oak tree that maybe the roots went out and ran into the side of the pot and started encircling. If you slice all of those off, you've essentially removed all the carbohydrate reserves. So in that case, it might be better to try and unwrap and work out some of those roots by hand. In other cases where you have most of the root system is concentrated on that outer wall of the root ball, if you were to slice that off, there may not be anything behind that. So maybe use your judgment on that. And also, of course, stress factors play a big role. In some cases, maybe slicing the root ball versus slicing it off. So do some vertical slices with a knife might be a good way to avoid too much damage, because just like pruning, that causes stress. So go ahead.
Yeah, that's what we recommend that. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Alex. That was a great presentation, and
so
appreciate you sharing that information with us this morning. Jill,
one last thing before I go. We have created a lot of videos, how to plant, how to prune, how to water, how to do anything with your tree. It's on our YouTube page under the Ask the Arborist video series. I will get the link and I will post it in the chat, and they're great resources. So I'll post it in the chat for y'all to get as well.
Thank you so much, Alex. And yes, please put the YouTube videos in the chat. They're fantastic. I'm sure folks would love to see them. Next up, we have Karen Giovingo. Alex, would you mind stopping your sharing of your presentation? There we go. Karen can get set up. Karen Giovingo is a program manager for our Ecoscapes program here at the University of Georgia Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant. I failed to introduce myself at the very beginning. I'm also with Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant. My name is Jill Gamble. Karen and I are colleagues, and she is our expert on sustainable landscaping. So Karen, are you able to share your screen?
Jill, are you seeing the screen now?
We are not.
Okay. Let me try this again. How about now?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Let me see here. I'm going to end the slideshow and I'm going to try it again. Okay, let's try this again.
Okay. There, I'm seeing something pop up. There we go. Now if you can, put it into.
You see it now?
We do, and you just have to do the display settings.
Is that working now?
Perfect. Take it
Great.
away.
Thank you for your, thank you all for your patience. Again, good morning, and I'm Karen Giovango. And as Jill said, I'm also with University of Georgia Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant, and I'm program coordinator and manager for what we call our Ecoscape Sustainable Land Use Program. I've been asked today to give you a broad overview of sustainable landscapes. It's something that's very important to me, and there is so much to share. But today I'm going to be limiting it to the following. I'm going to really be providing, first of all, what I call an ecological primer on the why of sustainable landscapes, regarding healthy ecosystems and the environmental challenges that are driving the role of what are sustainable landscapes. And then I'm going to share some components of what they are part of and the role that the environmental stewardship role of those components. And then I'm going to make a big switch and share just what I feel are some wonderful, oh, excuse me, I don't know how that happened, wonderful landscaping career opportunities. And fourthly, provide just a list of some of the national as well as regional organizations that are promoting native plants and availability. So first of all, these pictures, they kind of show an example. Here we are with some children in Brunswick, Georgia, celebrating Georgia Arbor Day and choosing to plant a native tree with Georgia Forestry Commission at their Boys and Girls Club. And on the right, there's Jane Goodall working in Uganda with a private landowner who is trying to restore lost forested habitat. And they're just examples of how we as humans are acknowledging that we're really part of nature, and that what we choose to do in our actions are important and have an impact, and they're part of a global feedback loop. I like to say that the loop is we make choices that are affecting the natural world, which then in turn affects us. So the natural world really depends on what we call healthy ecosystems. And you'll see 4 examples of healthy ecosystems that are comprised in Georgia. And they're basically native plant and animal populations. And they've evolved together over eons to form these very complex relationships. They work in balance with each other in healthy ecosystems, as well as with other non-living things. You might think of sands and soils. Let's say, you might say, well, I'm not really familiar with ecosystems, but truly you are. If I say Sahara Desert, or I see the Arctic tundra, you know, the non-living component you'll think of as the sand and the ice, but you'll also very likely be able to provide me very specific living species, such as a camel or a polar bear, that's very specific to that ecosystem type. And we're very lucky in Georgia because we are blessed with an array of ecosystems. And these healthy ones really provide and support very diverse and very rich communities of our native plants and animals. And we're lucky because we have many endemic species that don't occur anywhere else in the world. So why are healthy ecosystems important? Why am I spending all this time on them? Well, United Nations developed an ecosystem assessment team of over 200 experts in the world. And when they did their assessment, they determined that, quote, ecosystems are critical to human well-being for our health, prosperity, our security, and to our local, social, and cultural identity. So this is a big deal. And most importantly to us as humans, these ecosystems provide us what we call ecosystem services. And Alex had referred to them in his presentation earlier. And what are ecosystem services? Well, they're what nature provides us for free. So if you look at this wheel of supporting, provisioning, cultural, and regulating ecosystem services, just take a minute and look at that wheel and ask yourself, well, do I feel like I depend on any of these services? And another question may be, in the landscaping world, do I depend on any of these ecosystem services? And a very important component of ecosystem services is the biodiversity. And I mentioned that before. It's really key. And so the more diverse of life around us as humans, the more benefits of ecosystem services we're able to obtain. So what you're trying to really look for is the more diverse an ecosystem is, the more services it's going to be providing to us. But okay, Karen, let's be real. This is, what is currently happening in the world. Human populations continue to increase. And with that, we have development. And some of these development components can impact the natural world through habitat degradation and loss, fragmentation, as well as introduction of invasive species, which are species that are introduced into another environment that ultimately cause ecological and environmental damage to that newly introduced environment. And as these human populations are growing, people are needing more ecosystem services, but we're also reducing the biodiversity, so we're getting fewer services from them. And on top of that, if you look more on like a site scale level of landscapes, as we do develop, if you look at the figure on the left side, there are 4 examples. It's transitions from what we'd say what are natural areas, and I have it surrounded as a natural ground cover, which ultimately transitions all the way to the bottom right-hand corner, which is a highly urban environment. And in the natural ground cover, this is really an example of how nature manages our stormwater runoff. And in that kind of environment of meadows or forests, you're basically getting about 10% of surface runoff, whereby roughly 50% of it infiltrates either in a shallow aspect or more in terms of our groundwater recharging, whereas some of it evaporates. But if you go and look at that lower right-hand corner, move all the way to a highly urban environment, what we have is 55% surface stormwater runoff occurring. We have much less, down to 10 and 5% infiltration into our soils, into our aquifers. And what we result is what you see on the right. We get flooding, extensive flooding, and concerns about the actual water quantity of stormwater and the management of that in our communities. And also in the lower right-hand section, with that stormwater, it also picks up pollutants such as sediments and trash and nutrients and chemicals from lawns and oils, et cetera, all which also degrades our landscapes. And on top of that, this is all affecting our living organisms. A very recent study in 2019 determined that there's a dramatic rate decline of global insects diversity that may lead to extinction of 40% of the world's insect species over the next few decades. Now that's pretty huge. And in just a few slides, I'll explain the incredible role of insects in our landscapes. In addition to that, again, very recently in 2019, in North America study regarding wild bird populations, we're seeing a severe decline of the wild bird populations in North America. They've declined almost by 30% since 1970, and basically roughly 1 in 4 birds have disappeared in the last 50 years. So we have a challenge here. And as stated in one of the studies I cited, quote, a rethinking of current practices, in particular, a serious reduction in pesticide usage and its substation with more sustainable, ecologically based practices is urgently needed to slow or reverse current trends and safeguard the vital ecosystem services they provide. So here we got a call for action. And sometimes in my job, sometimes I'm overwhelmed by this what is going on in the world and what can I do? And I often go to Desmond Tutu's wise words, and I wanted to share them with you. Quote, "Do your little bit of good where you are. It's those little bits of good put together that can overwhelm the world." And so this is where sustainable landscapes can come in. As Benjamin Voigt said, a colleague of mine, our world is asking for landscapes to be more, to light the way to a new relationship with nature. So our challenge, we want to design and enhance our landscapes so that they're healthy, they're functioning, they're diverse, and they're also resilient parts of our local ecosystems. And that's very important when we're talking about climate change. So very quickly, I'm going to kind of share with you a little bit more of an ecological primer and how that translates to sustainable landscapes. So first of all, plant diversity. Okay, plants are absolutely key in the living systems of the world, and all energy is captured by plants. And all that energy captured by plants is provided to animals somehow through food, whether it's indirect or direct. So when you're looking at a landscape ecologically, the amount of vegetation in that landscape determines the amount of life that can be supported. Now, here we go with the insects. Now, insects are really important in sustainable landscapes. They are key. They are the most important group of all the animal types to transfer energy that was captured by the plants to other animals. An example is like insects relative to terrestrial bird young. Insects provide a critical food source for roughly 96% of the young. And the integration of the insects with native plants is quite profound and has occurred through thousands and thousands of years. 90% of all insects that eat plants, phytophagus, require native plants to complete their development. When I say native plants, it's basically the insects have evolved to feed on specific native plant species where they are, and they can't survive without them being available. An example is a Gulf fritillary that depends on the host plants of passion flowers, Passiflora species, to be able to have their larvae survive. And so ultimately, a diversity of native plants provides you that animal diversity. And so what we're trying to strive for is our landscapes mimicking that disappearing habitat that I mentioned before. And while doing that, supporting a diversity of wildlife while you're improving water quality, conserving water, and because they're native, they can enhance our community's sense of place and beauty and vitality. And these are examples, as you can see, like for instance, of just how you may be able to apply native landscapes into existing landscapes, as well as how to assist in providing and integrating more native plants into an existing landscape. On the bottom left, you'll see that native ground cover, which provides a more of a green mulch, is an option, as versus the use of turf grass that Alex mentioned. You can also provide and enhance native plantings with existing landscapes. So what is sustainable landscaping? Well, it's really natural resource-based practices. You're working with nature, you're trying to sustain local native plants and wildlife in your area, you're conserving that energy water, improving air and water quality, and providing beauty and pleasure. And it's really driven by you really have to concentrate on the mindful choices of the design, the plant selection and gardening, in order to provide those maximized values to the environment. And so I wanted to provide just some of the more major components of sustainable landscape and discuss them briefly. First and foremost, of course, the plants. In sustainable landscaping, you want to incorporate a diversity of regionally appropriate native plants that are endemic to your area. If you have invasive species, you want to remove them and do not plant any more of them. Water, there are many different aspects of water in sustainable landscaping. Some include selecting and choosing drought-tolerant native plants that fit a specific site condition. You want to keep and manage stormwater on site. You want to emanate how nature actually manages stormwater. And by doing that, you can reduce the stormwater runoff, improve water quality. And you can do that through examples of rain gardens and bioretention cells. And you also can conserve water by collecting rainwater. Healthy soils is very important. You want to compost. You know, when you have garden waste, where appropriate, you want to reuse them to help build that healthy soil. And you have a choice. You can use either organic mulch or perhaps in your beds install native ground covers that support the soil macrobenthicvertebrates and the healthy vegetation you're trying to strive to achieve. And another selection is keep leaf litter if you can. You know, mow it down if you need to, but keep leaf litter for healthy soils and the insect habitat and what enriches those trees and other plants. With wildlife, you want to provide water in a diverse landscape of different native plant habitats to provide the food, nesting, and shelter for the wildlife that are being attracted to your landscapes. Additional components entail chemicals. Now, this is a big one, and Alex referred to it as well. You want to eliminate the use of fertilizers and pesticides. When you're installing native plants into your landscape, similar to what Alex referred to with trees, they do not need synthetic fertilizers or chemicals, and in fact will not do well if you provide them. If you're worried about pest control, you're always seeking balance and biodiversity, and hopefully with that, the native plants that have evolved in an area have developed resistance to natural pests and diseases. But you also want to depend on natural pest control. And that is learning who your beneficial insects are, those predators and parasitoids that are attracted to your native plant landscape, that they themselves provide natural pest control to help you reduce or eliminate chemical needs. And if necessary, integrate in the integrated pest management if needed. And trees, well, Alex did such a beautiful job on that, but basically ideal, when you're lucky enough to have mature native trees, you keep them, and where appropriately, you plant new trees. And he mentioned a lot of the ecosystem services of trees, that absorb and store the carbon dioxide. They manage stormwater. They provide that wonderful wildlife habitat value. And especially in urban environments, their ability to reduce the heat islands. And with lawns, you're really trying to think about how can I further reduce chemical and water reuse? And you can achieve that by replacing some of that lawn turf with native plant beds. And use, oh, sorry for that. I'm very sorry, that's my dog. And where you can use manual electric powered yard tools. And lastly, but not least, buffers. I'm talking about riparian buffers, marsh buffers, etc. Even in terms of stormwater pond buffers, you can protect and restore native vegetative buffers. And in that way, you're protecting the waterways, assisting them and having polluted runoff fall into the waterways and cause soil erosion. Some key things regarding native plants and sustainable landscapes. Some of this information could take a whole nother presentation, but I just want to point out a few really key factors. that may be unique and different than more traditional landscapes that use ornamental plants. First of all, when you're talking about native plants, you want to think about ecoregions. Where is that site located that you're landscaping, and what ecoregion does it fall within Georgia? So I've circled example, I'm here on the coast in Brunswick, and I fall within the southern coastal plain. Ideally, I'm trying to select plants that are locally adapted to the ecoregion in the southern coastal plain. Because the ecoregion really gives you an idea of the kind of plants and plant communities that are indigenous to your area, that have evolved and are used to your climate, your precipitation, the soils, etc. And this is a little different, this ecoregion map, than a USDA plant hardiness zone map that some of you are probably very familiar with. And they're very helpful. The hardiness zone maps are very helpful for ornamental plants, which provide that average winter low temperatures. But when you're talking about native plants, I really strongly resort you to the ecoregion map itself. So let's say, for instance, you're interested in buying a American beautyberry, and I'm down in coastal Georgia, and let's say hypothetically I find out that, oh, there's a American beautyberry in Georgia, and it's in a nursery up in the upper Piedmont area. And there's also American beauty that's available down and just south of me in Florida, across the line. Now, where would you prefer to buy? Where's the best place to buy that particular individual plant? Well, it would be purchasing in that Florida native nurseries just south of us, but it's also occurring in that coastal plain. Although it's the same species, those individual plants have evolved to very particular ecoregion conditions. Another issue is, and this really applies to ornamentals as well, but really critical to ensuring survival and health of your sustainable landscape, is when you deal with native plants, you want to choose that right plant for the right site conditions. And there are tools to help you with that I'm not covering today, but if in any way you have questions about this, please email. I'll be able to provide you many, many tools. But let's say, for instance, you're sitting there thinking, oh, my client has said, oh, they want this native plant, this bright red native plant that draws in hummingbirds. And the site conditions that you're dealing with are dry and full sun. Well, these two species look very similar, but demand very different site conditions. For instance, the one on the left, Lobelia carnalis, the cardinal flower, it's stunning. It's a little tricky flower actually to grow, but it really needs moist to wet conditions, prefers part shade, maybe a little bit of sun, can handle flooding, but is not very good with drought tolerance. Versus on the right, the scarlet sage looks very similar, draws in those hummingbirds, but it really deals best in dry to maybe moist conditions, full sun, can't deal with much flooding as well. So you would select the scarlet sage for that particular landscape project you had. And a big issue with native plants, regretfully, in Georgia and some of the Southeast, is that the question the green industry people have a lot is, well, what is truly the native plant demand and what is the supply? And they've really been determined, native plants are valued for many different benefits. And the use of these materials really play an important role in maintenance and restoration for ecological needs such as native plant gene pools, communities, ecosystems as well, and can help relative to the trend of habitat loss and species loss. And I just want to provide you, although some of these are a little bit dated, I want to just provide you some citations of research in the Southeast that has looked at this. For instance, recent studies have shown that the use of native plants by landscape architects and contractors in Southeastern US has increased as a clientele interest level has in native plants. But they recommended to increase the use of native plant species by the landscape industry in the region by increasing the number of nurseries carrying native plants and the quantities and species to make them more available. Another study looked at the demand for native plants. They're saying is driven by an increased awareness to boost native pollinator populations and other wildlife. However, it said demand for native plants combined with the effects of the recession, and this is a little dated a year ago versus a decade ago in the recession, still has many growers facing a shortage to fill their orders. Also, native plant species are increasingly being utilized, and these are big clientele for native plant nurserymen, and need for appropriate sustainable landscapes is the species being utilized by federal and state agencies, as well as large private landowners that may be working with the federal or state agencies to restore native ecosystems. You also have Corps of Engineer and other federal agencies that are mitigating for lost habitat effects, that are really looking for and demanding appropriate supply of native plant species. Also, designers are using a significant proportion of regional native plants in their projects. That was part of a Southeastern US study. And lastly, the demand for native plants in the Southeast region exceeds the supply. Too few wholesale nurseries offer native plant materials, or they are insufficient in quantity or species available. And I spent a little bit of time on this today because you all are so important, and it's such an important niche that is really screaming for help and assistance, that we really truly need to address the supply challenges of native plant sourcing in order for us to be able to achieve and implement these sustainable landscapes. Next thing I wanted to do is just share, in my mind, some unique, maybe niche type of sustainable landscaping job opportunities. Some of these may be appropriate relative to people that are just starting out versus some that have had an interest in sustainable landscapes and are very interested to know, well, how can they further with their expertise and knowledge? I want to make it a point that all of you, all of us, we can really make the difference. Dr. Doug Ptolemy said, it is now within the power of individuals, or such as green industry, to do something that we all dream of doing to make a difference. And in this case, the difference will be to the future biodiversity, to the native plants and animals of North America and the ecosystems that sustain them. So we can make choices and we can assist in furthering these challenges. One of the biggest ones, which I somewhat just referred to, is the need in the nursery industry for native plant ecotypic sourcing, for native plant propagation and supply. When I talk about ecotypic sourcing, it's very difficult for clients, for agencies, for organizations, landscapes, architects, whatever, to be able to locate native plants that are indigenous to the area, to the ecoregion you're looking at for your landscape project. So this is huge. And if anybody's interested in this component, please let me know, because I'm currently working and investigating possibilities further on this. Another example, just the broad native landscape plant selection, getting to know plants, assisting clientele in what plants they should be choosing, the design, installment, and maintenance. That left up-hand corner is an example of a replacing of turf grass with a native ground cover called Phylla nodiflora. It's probably my favorite native plant name that exists, turkey tangle frog fruit. And this is something that's very resilient. People can walk on it. It keeps about that height. You may need to mow it here and there. Is a wonderful pollinator attractor, but forms very, very rich, deep mats of ground cover to replace turf. There's always these issues of, the native plant sourcing and what native plants to go, what native plant nurseries to go to. You also have the ability of you know, just the maintenance. Here's someone in the left-hand corner that's actually providing the needed and necessary water for establishment of this bioswale. And then maintenance issues. That's a huge issue in native landscapes, to know how best to maintain these plants for future thriving landscapes. Another big one is green infrastructure, low impact development, stormwater practices. And I'm referring to rain gardens, or the more engineered larger rain gardens that both entail native plantings to both manage stormwater as well as reduce pollutant loading in our waterways. This is a huge niche, and expertise in this field and assistance in the design and installment of these programs is huge. You have cities like the one in the right top left corner. The city of Chicago is installing thousands, well, maybe thousands, hundreds and hundreds of rain gardens throughout the city of Chicago to help assist in more natural-based stormwater management. So just examples here. Another one, native pollinator and other wildlife habitat. This is in demand, but the actual application can be huge. You might have resident clientele. You may have farmers, solar farm pollinator habitat, and that entails a lot of understanding of site prep and selection for those solar panels. But many farmers in Georgia are now integrating pollinator habitat into solar farms that they're putting on their landscapes. You have DOT and roadside pollinator plantings that are becoming more and more important. In fact, Florida just passed a law that regarding roadside plantings, where they're integrating and recognizing the need to identify remnant native plant populations in their roadside efforts. And there are also, of course, public areas where this applies. Another one, you know, with climate change, we're going to be seeing a lot more extremes in our weather and patterns, whether it's more drought tolerant at times versus extreme storm events. And drought tolerant landscapes is one way to really conserve our water resources as they get more and more critical with our groundwater aquifer challenges. Another one for those of you on the coast, or in an area where you might even have up north snow-related conditions of salt based on during storms and clearing of the road surfaces. Knowledge base of resilient salt-tolerant native plants that are used for either specific individual landscapes or for restorations. They can apply in dune restoration to living shorelines, to individual landowner marsh buffer zones, or what we call nature curtains, and residential landscapes. And last but not least, I just want to mention ethnobotany. This is where we're looking at how people in a culture or a region are using native plants in their area, to use them for food, medicine, shelter, dyes, fibers. Relative to the green industry, many of you may be aware that Yaupon holly, our native Ilex flammatoria, is the only known North American species that contains caffeine. And Yaupon tea is growing leaps and bounds, and the farming of Yaupon holly for this purpose is increasing. And even the idea of what holly components, Yaupon holly components, are best or used for different Yaupon tea mixtures. It's huge. Another example is, for instance, American black elderberry, which serves for many people a medicinal purpose. And the growth of the black elderberry and the actual ultimate transformation by others into these elderberry syrups or whatever is also in great need and demand. And then I just wanted to show an example of, for instance, a very coastal native plant Muhlenbergia philippes, which is different than Muhlenbergia capillaris, which people are most aware of and use in landscape plantings. This is truly coastal, and it's called sweetgrass, referred to as sweetgrass, and it's used by the Gulagichi communities to make these absolutely beautiful and stunning baskets weaved from the sweetgrass, palmetto, and pine. So I really try to provide you a very broad ideal of many, many little niches in sustainable landscapes, whether it's the actual growing of the plants to the application in landscapes that's really needed, essential, and is being driven by demand. And lastly, I just want to provide a sampling. And if you would like a copy of this, I'll be happy to have this shared to Jill and Craig to share with you all. And this is not complete, but I wanted to give you just an indication of the support of both national and regional nursery and native plant organizations that are there to provide interests, expertise, trainings, tools, et cetera, that promote sustainable landscaping, promoting native plants and their availability. This particular slide is national ones. And this next one is more of our Southeast regional and or state opportunities.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was fantastic. Greg Huber is a training coordinator with the UGA Center for Urban Agriculture. He's going to share some really exciting opportunities that we have thanks to funding from the University of Georgia Small Business Development Center. We're able to sponsor some professional development for the green industry here in Georgia. And we're really excited to begin launching that today. So Greg, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thank you, Jill. And thank you, Karen. Good information. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today and for our final session of this three-part webinar series. If you haven't seen the first two parts, I will post those links in the chat box for you. So we're going to talk just quickly about educational pathways. And so we've been talking about resiliency. Resiliency can be maybe applied in many ways. We started out kind of reflecting on what's happened over the last year, and we heard from Ben Campbell, and he spoke about some of the consumer trends and things that are happening in our state and what has happened over the last year. We then heard from the Small Business Development Center on financial considerations for resiliency and having a continuity plan of, how do you adapt to, sudden change in maybe your employee structure, or you may have individuals out sick. And so we've had to, adapt quickly to that. And then we heard from some industry practitioners and some of our industry associations about, pivoting and making a rapid change and sort of setting a leadership role in the landscape industry within your company to, set the tone of where things are going, what the company goals are, and just, reassure your employees that we're gonna get through this. We're gonna work as a team. We're gonna make some changes and actually found some things that may stick, as far as efficiencies go moving forward. So, how can we promote resiliency through education? Well, again, adaptability. If you have employees who can fill other roles within the company, efficiencies that you can develop. I know even with Steve Faber spoke about even office space being, maybe reprioritized as far as now we're working from home. And I think that COVID kind of accelerated some of the things that were happening already. And it just rapidly forced us into maybe more of a digital world than which we were moving towards, but it really put us to the test. And then, what are some of the roadblocks to horticulture education? So I worked as a horticulture instructor for 10 years in the technical college system. And just a couple of things to think about. None of us have really the, I would love to say, well, here's the answer to all of our problems in horticulture education, and how can we fill classrooms and have not have labor shortages like we talk about a lot in the landscape industry. What part of that is it interest? Is it getting young people interested in what we do? Is it how to navigate the educational system? You may have employees who maybe didn't finish high school, or maybe they did and they've never had a family member who went to college. And I know that I saw so many students get to the processes that are required to get enrolled in college and just get stuck or get hit roadblocks of not knowing how to navigate that. Sometimes just even within the industry, knowing how can you advance in your company? What's the next step for me as an employee? And then of course money and time, always considerations. So one of the things of the trends that we had a speaker, Cheryl Boyer, and she talked about agricultural storytelling. And there are some YouTube videos out there, where farmers tell their story about maybe the history of their farm and how their family got into farming and what their passion is within their, within their area. So I think as a green industry, we can also take notes from that. I think it's important to have a portfolio of your work to communicate not only to customers, but to set the vision for your employees. Company culture, I think, is an important part of that. And then, of course, how do I advance? And, you may have employees that are content with where they're at and they're happy with that, but you may have others who really aren't sure, where to go or feel trapped in what they're doing. So you need to make sure to communicate those advancement opportunities. And sometimes these are even simple things you can do, like, helping your employees to attain, a high school diploma or GED or, driver's license or to gain transportation, to give them experiences. I know one of my favorite things in school has always been field trips because it's eye-opening. Take them to some landscapes or gardens and this I think helps to develop good attitudes and feel positive about the work you're doing in the company. Helps build reputation. And then if you have employees who are seeking citizenship, help them to attain that goal. Big part of educational pathways, I think, is just navigation of showing the way. And I saw this sign and I thought this is perfect because imagine yourself dropped off in the middle of a country where you don't know the language or you don't know, how to get from one point A to point B as far as, physical directions. The same thing happens in education. What's my next step? So in our industry, there's just kind of an overview here, a mile high overview of maybe how that works. So we have kind of a transition from entry level worker or technician up to crew leader, maybe first line supervisors, and then that can go on to, operations and account managers. So what kinds of training plug in here? Well, we have on the job training, workshops and training, licensing and certification, and then post-secondary education. We can promote resiliency by just educating within our company in some of these required areas, pesticide applicators license, low voltage, electrical. These are things that we have to do anyway. So I think a lot of these do get taken care of just, intrinsically because they're required. But we also have training that's maybe non-regulatory. And that brings us to a couple of programs that I coordinate here at the center, and that's the Georgia Certified Landscape Professional and the Georgia Certified Plant Professional. These were developed in collaboration with industry, and I know we're just about out of time here, and I'm going to jump ahead. So, and then we have a super crew training, which is really geared towards maybe some of your new employees, and it comes with a series of videos, just kind of an outline of what these programs cover. There's 3 steps to becoming certified in these programs. You're going to register for the program, you're going to study, and when you're ready, we will administer the certification test. The program comes with online resources and some printed study materials, and each program is $165 each. Super Crew is a video series, and it's now gone to a streaming subscription. It's $549, but remember this could serve an entire company. It allows up to 15 devices to stream. A Super Crew is in English and Spanish as well. Comes with an 11 series here, and each of these has a quiz at the end. So participants in that program would receive a certificate by completing those quizzes. But the highlight here of my presentation, and I want to thank you again for being here, is that we are able, through this grant for a limited time, we can offer these access to these programs at no cost. We're accepting applications through June the 1st, and then we will review those and prioritize those. Our goals are to promote business resiliency, so we will give priority to applications for those employed in the industry with a company or a company owner. And we're going to have to limit, though, to one sponsored registration per company, because we want to reach as many companies as we can. But this is just one way that we can utilize some of the CARES Act funds to strengthen our companies and to promote education within those companies. So I have a website here, the one on the top, the bit.ly/UGA-trainings will take you to the application page. If you just want to learn more about those programs, the Certified Landscape and Plant Professional, you can go to this website on the lower right here, the UGAUrbanAg.com. Look for the certification tab. And we're also, if you register for this program, we're going to send you an email flyer that will give you a little bit more information. So with that, we do have some scheduled exams coming up. The next one for GCLP is December. And then we have an August 10th date set for Plant Professional. Jill, I think, posted these links in your chat box. Couple just of final thoughts here. Step up to challenges as a team. Eliminate the pathways of opportunity. Develop good habits. Communicate your expectations, and of course, celebrate great moments as a company.
Thank you so much for joining us. We will send out links and resources to everyone who attended. I know we had a lot of great resources shared here, so we will be sure to share that with you, as well as the flyer with more information on these professional development opportunities so that you can register if you're interested. Thank you so much.